Okay.
Okay, Lisa, let me introduce you. We'll be real formal. Okay, hi everyone, even though we're already recording, welcome this morning to our panel at 8:30 in the morning to a group of 4 tired parents. And the title of our panel is Modernity and Modernization in late 19th and 20th century Latin America. We actually organized this panel a couple years ago, so I'm glad that we're actually getting to do it, even though I wish we were in New Orleans, but oh well. So our first presenter is going to be Lisa Pinley Covert from the College of Charleston, and the name of her paper, maybe unless she's changed it, is The Materiality of Modernity in the Aftermath of the 1950 Cusco Earthquake.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And it's great to see folks. So I want to just start off with a little story. In February of 2019, I was getting myself settled into bed in Lima in the 5th floor of an apartment building when the whole thing started to shake. And a couple of things went through my mind. The first thing that went through my mind was, what on earth am I doing here? I shouldn't be here. And the second thing that went through my mind was, this is definitely karma for studying an earthquake. You know, I was very grateful, though, that the building, fairly new building that I was staying in, did what it was supposed to do. It moved the right way in an earthquake. I was safe. Everybody was safe. But when I was there, you know, I was there in Lima starting research on a 1950 earthquake in Cusco. And specifically, I'm interested in the efforts to reconstruct and modernize the city in the aftermath of that earthquake. The earthquake hit on a Sunday afternoon, May 21st, 1950. It was estimated to be a 7 on what's known as the modified Mercalli scale, which doesn't really have like a direct equivalent to the Richter scale. They kind of measure different things, but people estimate it was probably between like a 5 and a 6.5 on the Richter scale. So it was a pretty sizable quake. The human toll was high. There were over 100 fatalities and hundreds more injured. A lot of people speculate that more people would have died if it happened at a different time. But because it was on a Sunday afternoon, a majority of the city was actually watching a football match in the arena. And so perhaps it's a little apocryphal, but that's why people say that the fatalities and casualties were not worse. The quake also damaged thousands of buildings and really crippled the city's infrastructure, and it rendered about 2/3 of the city uninhabitable. And so my broader project explores the aftermath of this quake. What were the priorities? What were the different visions for how to reconstruct the city and how to make it a modern city? This was a topic of much discussion and debate. And I'm also really interested in why certain visions for the city's future came to fruition and others did not. So kind of looking at what were the things that were out there in the topic of debate and why did things take a certain path. So as Jackie mentioned, a funny thing about the paper for today, what I originally proposed when we did these proposals in 2019 to present in 2020, I thought that I would be working on some materials that I had gathered from research in the Rockefeller Archive Center, which is what I was supposed to do in the summer of 2020. And I still haven't done that. I still haven't done that research, but I'm kind of trying to build up the story around that until I'm able to get to that point. And so what I want to focus on today are some of the debates that occurred about construction materials in the aftermath of the earthquake. And I want to talk about this because I feel like it offers an interesting window into ideas about modernity, specifically the roles that modern technology and expertise played in the post-disaster reconstruction efforts. And so there's sort of 2 different levels of debates that I trace in the larger project, and the debate over construction materials kind of spans both. the first level is humanitarian relief, like immediate aftermath of the earthquake. How do we help people right now? How do we get people in housing? How do we make sure they're safe and fed? And then there was sort of long-term debates about long-term reconstruction and development. And so this was about like, how do we help Cusco in the future after the immediate recovery? How do we set it on a path for, modernization, basically? And so, like I mentioned, the debate about construction materials really spans these two concerns. Most of the buildings that collapsed, especially homes that were sort of outside of the city center, were adobe structures. And, so they're made of mud, water, other organic materials. And historian Mark Healy, he wrote about this in his study of the earthquake in Argentina in 1944. Adobe was a target of a lot of these sort of modernization projects because it was seen as not safe, not stable in the long term, and also as unsanitary. And so, there's a lot of research and writing that has sort of been done about this adobe versus concrete debate. And so I don't have a lot new to add to that, except for specific context within Cusco itself. And a couple of things about Cusco made this debate a little bit different. The first was geography. Just because of its location in the Andes, it's very difficult and really, really expensive to get construction materials to Cusco. And so the need for access to a cement plant and concrete became one of the top post-earthquake priorities for international technicians who were evaluating the situation. So geography was one. The other thing that's different about Cusco is the historic preservation side of things. And one of the things that led to a lot of damage, especially in the sort of Spanish colonial era structures in the sort of historic center of Cusco, was kind of sloppy previous preservation efforts, use of brick and mortar that just wasn't really well done, that just kind of crumbled under pressure. And there was also a lot of, these materials were deteriorating really quickly because of water damage, just like leaks and things like that. And so one of the big problems was, what do we do with these historic buildings? Can we rebuild them with like modern concrete, or do we need to use historic techniques to maintain the integrity of like the historic character of the buildings? And so these debates made the conversation about the need for concrete particularly intense. And so there were several technicians and different people who were called in to evaluate Cusco in the aftermath of the earthquake. The Peruvian government called in the United Nations fairly early on for technical assistance. And basically they called in these international technicians for a lot of reasons. One was because within Peru there was a lot of disagreement about how to prioritize reconstruction, but also United Nations, this is 1950, it's a fairly new organization. UNESCO, which I've done some research on related to this project about some other topics, also fairly new, and also we're just kind of figuring out what role they were going to play in this sort of post-disaster relief situations. So Peru called in the United Nations, and the United Nations commissioned this guy, Robert Hudgens, to write a report. And Hudgens, in his report, are really interesting to me, and this is actually why I want to get into the Rockefeller Archive Center, because Hudgens was the director of the American International Association for Economic and Social Development. And it's goes by the acronym AIA. And what this organization was sort of like a private entity that was created by Nelson Rockefeller in 1946 as sort of like an outgrowth of his work with the OCIAA during the war. So, he was doing all of these sort of like inter-American development type projects during World War II. And And there were several kind of private entities and some that were still under the Rockefeller Foundation umbrella that emerge out of that and are really involved in development in the Americas and in the aftermath. So Hudgens is called in. He writes this report. It's a pretty long and detailed report, and I'm still trying to kind of untangle what actually happened in what he suggested and was actually came to fruition and what didn't. But one of the things I'm interested in for our purposes today is one of his main recommendations was that Cusco, like the post-earthquake response was too narrowly focused on the urban area, and that for Cusco to have long-term stability, there needed to be more focus on the entire region, including the rural areas. And he saw a cement plant and a hydroelectric plant as sort of the two essential components of that. And so the hydroelectric plant will be for another day, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about why cement was seen as so important. So like I said, it was very hard and expensive to get construction materials to Cusco. This was one of the major challenges in the aftermath of the earthquake. How do we rebuild? We can't get stuff here. It was really expensive to fly things, especially construction equipment, and took a really long time to get them there by road or rail. And so the idea was that if there was a cement plant, cement was seen as this sort of epitome of modern technology. It used science, but it was also inexpensive and accessible technology if you had, the plant in the right place. And so the idea was if you had a cement plant, then you could use it to build, create concrete. And reinforced concrete was sort of what the ideal was for how to rebuild these structures in a way that would withstand future seismic activity. And so this was sort of seen as part of this like broader vision. And I would share with you a map, but I couldn't figure out how to share my screen right. But there was this vision called Plan Piloto in the aftermath of the earthquake for how to modernize the city. And basically they envisioned Cusco. If anyone has been there today, it seems kind of funny to look at these plans because it's like a very streamlined, sleek roads, separate residential spaces and industrial spaces. Like they just wanted to like completely redo it in like a modern way, like broad streets, things like that. And so concrete was going to be an essential part of that. Part of the goal was to make it more automobile friendly, the footprint of the city, which it's not in the central part at all. Okay, so there's this big plan. They do end up calling in a technician from the United Nations. He looks around the Cusco region, identifies places for a cement plant. I know there was at least one. I think there were a couple that were created right in the immediate aftermath of this in the 1950s. So the cement plant comes to fruition, but what were the actual outcomes for Cusco? Well, one of the funny things, I don't know, maybe not funny is not the right word, ironic things is that the concerns about housing was one of the main things that prompted the need for having concrete, like reinforced concrete in the structures. And one of the problems that emerged is that because it took several years for the cement plant to finally come to fruition, like 6 or 7 years after the earthquake before it was able to like fully function and produce enough to supply enough cement to make concrete. A lot of the housing had already been rebuilt using adobe. There was a sort of regulation passed by the city right in the aftermath of the quake that said like you cannot rebuild with adobe. We will not allowed to be to do that. But then they threw it out the window like right away because people just needed a place to live and adobe was cheap and that's why people had been using it. And so it, there was certainly in the outskirts of the city and some of the later housing that was built and newer buildings were used reinforced concrete. But in the immediate aftermath, there's still a lot of adobe that was used in the city, and you can still see some of that to this day. So it didn't really play a role in the housing plan like people thought it would. And the other problem is that concrete is really highly specialized. It takes a long time to learn how to do it right and well. And this is part of the problem with some of the historic preservation in the years prior. The bricks that had been made kind of sloppily and couldn't really withstand the elements. And so it turned out not being something that could quickly be implemented in a citywide way. The other problem is that the modern ideas about seismically sound construction really clashed with the simple truth that ancient Incan structures suffer the least damage from the earthquake. And this is what I really, really want to look for in the archives. So far, in a lot of the reporting, I really only see silences about the fact that the Incan foundations of most of the buildings in the city center remained intact. Like they were using a very advanced anti-seismic technology, and there's like almost no conversation about how do we do that? Instead, the Incan foundations, walls that remain throughout the city were really seen as an impediment to modernity. They were looking for ways to remove these walls, remove the foundations to like expand streets and things like that. And so I'm really interested in this juxtaposition of, on the one hand, we can use modern technology and create this anti-seismic new technology. And then on the other hand, to sort of silences about the Incan foundations and their anti-seismic technology. And, one of the interesting things, like I don't know a lot about the building that I was in Lima, but I grew up in Southern California, and I know that a lot of the anti-seismic technology in buildings is actually operating according to the principles of some of the Incan foundations, which is about movement, right? Like allowing like frictionless movement instead of trying to create like steel reinforced walls. And so one of the things that I'm kind of interested in tracing, just to kind of close, and obviously this is still very much in progress, but I'm interested in sort of tracing, these ideas about what's modern, how do we make Cusco modern, and how in these debates, there's a tendency to really overlook what has been resilient and has lasted in that place for so long. So that's one of the tensions that I'm hoping to explore more. And I'll go ahead and close there. But thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Lisa. It's so exciting to hear the progress of these projects. Anyway, okay, so next on the docket, we have Beau Gators. Beau is, wait a second, Beau. It says here you're at Winston-Salem State University, but no longer.
Nope, I'm next door to Chad.
That's right. Okay, so Beau, what is your official title and location now?
I am an assistant professor of history in the Department of History at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
Yay! And the title of his paper today is Environment, Epidemics, and Eradication, Veracruz in late 19th and early 20th century Mexican modernization efforts.
Right. I have so many questions for your paper, Lisa, but we'll go with this for now. Share screen 2. Okay. Can everyone see? All right, I'm going to read because I was thinking about this project and I can be all over the place. So let's just go. In the Gulf of Mexico lies one of Mexico's most important port cities, Villarrica de la Veracruz. Veracruz serves several purposes for Mexico. It is a central tourist destination, especially during Carnival season. I was in Carnival mode when I was writing this. As thousands of people come from the interior of Mexico to this port city and internationally to enjoy the festivities in Veracruz. Beyond the social activities, Veracruz serves as Mexico's main naval base in the Gulf of Mexico. One of Veracruz's most important functions is as a central trading depot for Mexico with the international community, a position that it has had since the colonial times. Veracruz exists in a tropical climate, a climate which has placed the state of Veracruz as a central space for agricultural opportunities for the production of coffee, tobacco, and sugar, and mangoes, and I can just keep going on and on. How I miss Veracruz. Since colonial times, Veracruz was a bustling city with commercial activity from dawn until dusk. Travel narratives discuss how shouts rang out as dock workers unloaded ships arriving from the farthest reaches of the Atlantic world and the close ports of the Gulf of Mexico. Throughout the colonial and independence periods, Veracruz existed as one of the principal ports of Mexico, as a space where goods, people, and ideas constantly passed through. Despite its commercial centrality, fears of outbreak of disease produced an image of the city as a, quote, metropolis of pestilence. Although, this is the one I want. The tropical climate that made the region agriculturally productive and the city a lucrative locale also led elites to view the port as unsanitary and physically unattractive for settlement due to its susceptibility to mosquito-borne diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. Government officials' poor handling of public hygiene and sanitation, combined with the region's climatic conditions, positioned Veracruz as a perfect incubator for tropical diseases. During the rainy season, the health hazards related to the disease increased heavily. Many travelers noted the irony that the two hospitals in the city served more as they put it, potential health hazards than as places of refuge and recovery. This was the case for many hospitals throughout the Atlantic world during the 19th century. As a result, people historically avoided remaining in the port city and settled in more comfortable cities such as Jalapa, located 40 miles away from Veracruz and comfortably situated within the mountains. Awesome. Veracruz did not simply serve as a harbor for disease or a way station for passersby. At the dawn of independence, Veracruz existed as an international trade link to the Gulf of Mexico, and its inhabitants conducted commerce with traders in cities such as Havana and New Orleans, which is where I thought we'd be, and participated in the broader Caribbean and Atlantic trade networks with traders in cities such as Caracas and Cartagena, as well as the European nations of England, France, and Spain. As such, Veracruz remained a vital economic interest as ships continued to load and replenish their cargoes in the city's harbor. This map here shows the connections of Veracruz to Latin American port cities. However, Veracruz, as I mentioned, also had close ties to places like New Orleans, Charleston, and New York City. In the broader project, I'm looking at how the U.S., in another project, I was looking at how the U.S. depicted this commercial relationship, especially in reference to the impact of yellow fever in Veracruz on trade endeavors. While outbreaks of yellow fever in Veracruz existed before the dawn of independence, the U.S. imagined yellow fever in Veracruz in the early decades of Mexican independence in close connection to the well-being of the United States in concerns of economics and health. What I've come to see is that in periodicals, they consistently depicted this relationship and discussed the role of yellow fever in Veracruz in the United States-Mexico trade relations. So here's some examples. By the early independence period, Veracruz was seen as clean in comparison to U.S. cities as a result of the changes created in the late colonial period. As one contributor to the Boston Commercial Gazette wrote in January of 1823, quote, "The city of Veracruz is represented as one of the prettiest foreign towns, which the writer has seen. For symmetry and cleanliness, it will vie with Philadelphia," end quote. When Mexico, and by extension Veracruz, gained its independence, despite perceptions of its cleanliness and the continued trade, the health conditions of the port remained an issue that U.S. periodicals reported on in their depictions of the city. From the first entrance of the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Joy Roberts Poinsett, the position of yellow fever in Veracruz received significant attention in U.S. periodicals. A letter from the Charleston Carrier, getting to you, Lisa, immediately engaged the outbreak of yellow fever in January of 1823 and how it brought business to a standstill and reduced adventurers of all nations to poverty. As a result of the outbreak, quote, The city of Veracruz was represented to be in a dreadful situation, end quote. By February of 1823, discussions of quarantines of ships coming from Veracruz also emerged in periodicals. The opportunities created with the coming of independence simultaneously enhanced stronger international commerce and placed Veracruz as a hotbed of violence during times of international conflict. This circumstance forced inhabitants of Veracruz to face the murky nature of uncertainty and insecurity that independence brought. While yellow fever in Veracruz was a constant issue in trade in the U.S. imaginary, it also impacted the U.S. during times of conflict, specifically during the Mexican-American War of 1846. Most of you, I think there are 4 of us here, so most of you may know of the final results of this war that led to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Yet, I want to go back a little bit. When the U.S. and Mexico engaged in war, the strategic plan to enter Mexico by sea would have been through Veracruz. Here we go. So, the potential for yellow fever outbreaks limited the time frame for an invasion. As the tri-weekly Ohio Statesman mentioned, quote, nothing will happen until after the black vomit or yellow fever, which now prevails in Veracruz, subsides. This may be expected about the 1st of October, end quote. This is in 1846 that this comes out. According to an August 1846 report from the Newburyport Herald and the Massachusetts Spy, the U.S. troops stationed themselves under Green Island, Isla Verde, outside of Veracruz. Both periodicals reported that yellow fever caused a great havoc among Mexican troops on the island and the city. More specifically, it stated, the soldiers, being mostly from the interior, are not accustomed to the climate and therefore suffer in health very severely. Going a little bit further, in 1847, when General Scott and his fleet of the United States Navy approached the shores of Veracruz, he stated, quote, when we approached the port of Veracruz, their land cannons had the capacity to sink the entire American Navy. However, these cannons remained, for Scott, inexplicably silent during the initial stages of the U.S. invasion. The boom of the cannon fire only began after the U.S. military forces landed on the shores of Veracruz. What Scott did not know was that in this particular instance, confusion, conflict, and fear of contamination in the Mexican ranks hindered a direct course of action to defend the port, resulting in the cannons being fired only after the U.S. landed. The American military knew of the yellow fever season that started in April or early May during the invasion of 1847. In fact, they also knew of the northern winds that would lead to an exasperated spread of the disease each year. The story of Veracruz in the early 19th century represents the linkages between knowledge circulation, migration, commerce, and disease. People from the states directly linked to trade with Veracruz would have constant reminders of the port city and its potential to spread its devastation to the cities in the United States. In fact, Veracruz drew the attention of the varied occurrences of Veracruz in U.S. newspapers illustrates that it was not only part of the American psyche, it was also tied to the U.S. in terms of commerce, progress, and health concerns. In fact, Veracruz drew the attention of the international health community as researchers collaborated across linguistic and political barriers to address concerns revolving around yellow fever. What I seek to do in the broader project is to explore how physicians and researchers travel to Veracruz to conduct yellow fever research. More specifically, doctors like U.S. Army physician George Sternberg traveled to Mexico to study the causes and potential cures for this aggressive outbreaks with local Mexican doctors such as Dr. Carmona Ivalle of Mexico City and Dr. Daniel Ruiz of Veracruz. Given the prevalence of the disease in many countries, national governments instituted the creation of scientific health boards to study tropical diseases. While some of the boards had specifically national aims, they were often international in their composition and in the areas that they conducted investigations. In 1879, the U.S. created the National Board of Sanitation after the sweeping impact of yellow fever outbreaks in 1878 in the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, again attesting to the emphasis on environment and attempted disease eradication. This board then organized a commission to visit the West Indies with the purpose of studying yellow fever. They had a 3-month stay in Havana as the first leg of their research, and then traveled to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, showing the international scope of their research. Perfect. Dr. George Sternberg, a key contributor to this research committee, had conducted yellow fever research in the early 1870s in Florida, where he had constant contact with yellow fever patients and had contracted yellow fever himself and recovered. After contracting the disease, he made it a personal and professional mission to find the causes of the disease. His quest started in the 1870s, and he ventured several times to Cuba under the special orders from the government of the United States to carry out his research. His role in the American Commission for the Study of Yellow Fever in Cuba placed him in direct contact with individuals participating in this research. We'll jump ahead a little bit. I show this image just because at this time, Veracruz was surrounded by a wall that had been constructed in the colonial period to help defend it from pirates and other invasions that it suffered several times. However, by the 1870s, the notion that this wall kept diseases within was addressed by officials who then used imprisoned individuals to destroy the wall around the city. If you travel to Veracruz, you can see some of the remnants of that wall as you go to the outskirts of the city. And so this is the point that I wanted to get to. In the 1920 biography of her husband, Dr. George Sternberg, Martha L. Sternberg recounted a brief conversation during an 1888 trip from Rio de Janeiro to Mexico. In her recollection, she states that, quote, "I said to him one day, if we were going home, how happy we would both be." She was kind of tired of all of the travels over months. And then she asked, "Why do you want to go to Mexico?" He looked appealingly at me while he replied, "Because I have given so much of my time and strength to the investigation of the cause and spread of yellow fever that I feel I have exhausted all the legitimate experimental methods that could elucidate the subject. I hope that in Mexico I can arrange to make human inoculations. In our own country, that is not possible. And I now think that this is the only way this problem will ever be solved." So he traveled to Mexico. He met with Dr. Carmona y Valle, and Dr. Carmona y Valle suggested that he travel back to Veracruz, where these inoculations were taking place. As Sternberg entered the tropical climate of the port city of Veracruz, the humidity and the swarming of mosquitoes that blanketed the port may have overwhelmed him. In 1885, Dr. Daniel Ruiz of Veracruz had inoculated blood of a yellow fever patient to a healthy patient to determine if thereby the infection could be transmitted. The first experiment led to a successful transmission of yellow fever from one person to another. And to be clear, this was successful for the doctor, not for the patient who received it. Ruiz ventured away from the established notion that yellow fever spread only through the air and as a result of a bad environment. My preliminary research findings have not uncovered how Dr. Ruiz encountered his patients, although the state of their yellow fever suggests that he found them in one of the two citizen hospitals in Veracruz, the San Juan de Montes Claros and the San Carlos hospitals. These hospitals, since the colonial period, had a reputation for being incubators of disease more than as spaces for recuperation, and during this particular period. This brief interaction between Sternberg and Daniel Ruiz reflects a small part of the crucial role that Veracruz played in research on yellow fever. It reflects one of the occurrences of the meetings of the minds of an international body of researchers who would influence policy and procedure in the attempted eradication of yellow fever in Mexico and in the broader Atlantic. In the larger project, I plan to expand on the scope of how Veracruz was deeply embedded in political and medical discourse about tropical diseases and eradication in the 19th century, and as a key site of international yellow fever research. I will explore the diverse actions of a variety of political actors, urban residents, the national government, and international researchers, and how they prove crucial in investigations on the cause and potential prevention of the spread of yellow fever among various groupings of Mexican residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Beau. Okay, next we have Chad Thomas Black. I never say the Thomas part. Chad Black from the University of Tennessee, and he is going to be presenting a paper called Riding to the Future, Bicycles and Modernity in it's French. Fin de Siècle, Latin America. Chad.
It's really nice to see all of you.
I know.
Yeah, we proposed this panel long ago enough that Beau wasn't even a colleague of mine yet. And yet here we are now. And I'd like to point out that it is impossible to get a good muffaletta in my kitchen. And, you know, my dog always looks at me like I'm insane when I'm dancing to the Dirty Dozen brass band. So let's see here. Find my thing. See this? Yeah. Okay. I'd like to start off today with like two different little bits of media. And I doubt this is going to look good over, you know, Hop-In's app. This first one, I'll go ahead and press play, but like I said, I mean, it's probably not good. Oh. And now it's not even going to work. There we go. Okay. On the evening of Thursday, the 27th of August, 1896, Mexican President Porfirio Diaz gathered with a group of 50 friends, family, and associates at the Castillo de Chapultepec for a personal screening of vistas from the Lumiere Film Company. The evening was highlighted by the debut of El Presidente de la República paseando a caballo en el bosque de Chapultepec, the film. It's on YouTube right there. And this was a view that would also be shown at the Paris Exposition in 1900. And in it, Diaz rides up in a group on horseback to the camera's fixed frame. He's dressed in a smart, modern riding suit and a bowler hat and has a difficult time gauging his position relative to the camera, circling in and out of the frame as he tips the brim of his hat. He appears to be looking beyond the lens, perhaps listening to instructions from Gabriel Vera, the Lumiere brothers' technical director, and one of two representatives that were sent by the company to introduce their moving picture technology to the Mexican market. After a few awkward seconds in front of the camera, Diaz pauses, and a uniformed officer walks into view and salutes him. But in the background, a group of 7 men and women riding bicycles come into view, pulling over to watch what would have been for them quite a strange scene. A man with an umbrella walks into the frame and tries futilely to shoo them away, while Diaz and his coterie turn and ride away out of view. For a brief moment, the cyclists actually outnumbered the equestrians. This encounter between cyclists and equestrians in Chapultepec Forest ended much better than many other confrontations between the two in streets of the cities around the world during the bicycle boom of the 1890s. But the conflict between our umbrella-toting man and those a wheel reveal a tension in Mexican modernity that the Lumiere filmmakers were seeking to portray to both Diaz and to elite and popular audiences of those films. Early films by these very early filmmakers in the mid 1890s focused on scenes such as workers leaving factories on foot or bicycles, or the arrival and disembarkation of a train in order to highlight movement, which makes sense because these were moving pictures after all. These early films made in Mexico partly engaged in this same kind of images of modernity, capturing movement with things like the arrival of the train in Veracruz. But also they attempted to capture movement through things that would be perceived by the audiences as traditional Mexico. Rurales galloping past an old aqueduct, cockfights, cowboys, indigenous peones dancing. This ambivalent modernity, this mixed temporalities and the bicycle's presence in it is an important point in understanding the experience of the bicycle boom that I'm going to circle back to here in a couple of minutes. Our second media moment comes from the January 1900 edition of the Argentine porteño magazine Caras y Caretas. To greet the new century, Caras y Caretas published a cartoon titled Locomotion of the 20th Century that featured methods of mobility outpacing the historical past. Sprinting past the raised hand of the future, represented by a beautiful, well-festooned woman, are the two great innovations of personal transportation at the end of the 19th century, the automobile and the bicycle. The automobile driver's shirt is marked Siglo XX, or at least XX, it's the tire of the bicycle's front wheel that edges his vehicle into the future. In the past, they leave a crippled old pedestrian leaning on a crutch, a broken down horse carriage and cart, or a horse and cart, whose driver is labeled Diecinueve, horse-drawn streetcars, a stagecoach, and even a train. The hope of the new century, the future, was individual transport, movement, speed, mobility, exemplified in the technology of the bicycle as much as the car. Bicycles are an interesting artifact to explore the culture of global capitalism and class formation during the boom in the 1890s, in part because of their multifaceted nature, and in part because of the simultaneity of the boom, both in places that produced bicycles and in places that only imported and used them. They represent a form of exercise and sport, and the social linkages around physical culture. Here in 1896, the Guatemalan magazine Ilustración Guatemalteca, we have portraits of local racers as well as a cycling club that's in that really tiny picture. The cycling club out on an excursion into the countryside. In fact, some of the 20th century's great villains were avid cyclists in the 1890s. This is Jorge Ubico, eventual dictator of Guatemala. Bicycles are also a form of transportation and work and labor. This is late 1890s police in Buenos Aires, a wheel in a taking part in a parade. Lastly, I should have included a picture of a kid with bicycles. They were toys. They were, associated with youth, but also they were a technology, a consumer technology that has as much in common with the camera, the sewing machine, the typewriter, and the gramophone as anything else. In this way, the bicycle embodies the nexus of sport and technology as imported forms that become a part of Latin America's modernity. The analog here is in some ways to football. When did soccer become a local practice and not just a game that was imported from England? As a sport and a social practice, but also, the typewriter used by the ubiquitous figure of the in plazas around Latin America, providing literate services to all comers. What I'm interested in is as much the question, why did the bicycle boom happen in major cities south of the Rio Grande simultaneous to the boom in the global north? But also in the question of how can we understand the phenomenology of the bicycle as a domestic and imported practice technology, the experience of time and space and the body that bicycles provide. In teasing out this relationship, I think it would be productive to consider the bicycle as a cultural manifestation of the process of uneven and combined development, as a bearer of class participation, consciousness, identity under global capitalism. And by this, I mean, if we take for granted the nation state as the natural unit of class analysis for the existence of a domestic bourgeoisie or middle class, or to measure the modernity or backwardness of a country rather than as an artificial construct of convenience for the organization of capital flows and resources exploitations in the 19th century, we risk missing the transnational nature of class consciousness while reinforcing the ideological backwardness justified the political economy of capital's empire. Or to put this another way, the adoption and experience of the bicycle as a practice technology is an interesting entrepot to the culture of geopolitical and economic realities of uneven but combined development. The ideological assumptions of both modernization and dependency theory are predicated on the idea that under capitalism there remains geographical and socioeconomic practices that were temporally coded as backward or traditional and exist outside of capital. A dynamic that plays out repeatedly in both transition debates and in corporation debates. In nation states coded as backward or traditional, the adoption of technologies, cultural practices, clothing, cooking, literature, music, or values appear as mimicry of the West. Regions, as well as social classes or other groups within nation states, then get reorganized as either being productive or as fetters or victims of transition or incorporation. But Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development suggests another kind of organization of space and time where the backward and the traditional continues to exist, but is subsumed by the engine of accumulation and thus becomes equally modern. In this way, combination and unevenness become constitutive of capital itself and define the process, how this process is experienced in the everyday. So that people who ride bicycles in the 1890s are actually participating in the construction of the physical culture and experience of a middle class or bourgeois modernity that's constitutive of this thing globally or transnationally, and not simply, being bende patrias or giving up on traditional Mexicanness or Argentineness or something like that. This quote by Benedict Anderson, and I'm pulling on him because in part, one of the first things that I'd like to note is that the bicycle boom itself was a global phenomenon from roughly 1892 to 1900 that was a product of media culture. Even before specialized sporting papers or sports sections, newspapers in Latin America included bits and pieces on velocipedes going back to the 1860s. And there are thousands and thousands of articles on bicycles that you can find in these papers from Mexico all the way down to Argentina during this time. People were interested in these things because bicycles were novelties. They were circus, associated with circuses or with feats of daring. They were interested in speed, in racing and records. They were interested in endurance and distance and touring and excursions. They were interested in invention. For some reason, they were particularly obsessed with reading about the invention of bicycles used for the water, on water, like water cycles for some strange reason. This consumption of news helped create pockets of cycling culture that were mutually recognizable, not only, during the bicycle boom in cities around the globe, but really to cyclists today. This cartoon from El Hijo de Aguizote says, why ride bicycles? And it gives 7 different reasons here. And they are things like for fun, for distraction from the streets, to get skinny, to pay the salary of your nanny, because you have a debt at the end of the month, for love, and for the amusement of children. These are things that cyclists today absolutely would still recognize because it's sort of the overdetermination of the phenomenological experience of riding a bicycle. Here's another one. It's titled Sporting Conversation. In the first hour, they talk about records and velodromes. In the second hour, they talk about kilometers and pneumatic tires. In the third hour, they talk about bicycles and tandems. In the fourth hour, it's pedals and handlebars. In the fifth hour, it's tires and tracks. In the sixth hour, it's velodromes and records again. And anybody who's ever gone on a group ride as a cyclist would know that these are still the exact same kinds of conversations that people have today. It is a recognition, if you will, of like how this becomes from a media process to a participatory process in which a recognizable cycling culture gets reinvented again and again in cities around Latin America. Here, we also have an image of what your group of sportsmen looks like in the 1890s, and it's well-dressed men with bicycles who go to the track at Palermo to also, pull for their favorite horses in the races. So, they were dandies, I guess you could say. Okay. Second aspect of this is that the overdetermination of the bicycle on these local cultures and experiences of space and time. Borrowing from Paul Virilio here, this quote, "The invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck." Cycling, you could say the invention of the bicycle was also the invention of the header, where conflicts in streets over access to the street and over the terrifying nature of the speed of bicycles caused all kinds of conflicts and actual collisions between pedestrians and horses and, horse-drawn forms of transportation. In fact, the idea of cyclists crashing was so normalized that we have a bunch of political cartoons that borrowed that concept to demonstrate the way that social changes and hopes for the future can be, taken out by obstacles, political obstacles, health obstacles, etc. Here's Death trying to chasing this guy, but potentially Beau being undone by hygiene and curanderas. Oftentimes, when we see the portrayal of cycling and how it intersects with international politics and economics, we also get this idea that collisions and accidents are sort of fundamentally constitutive of political economy of the day, as expressed through the bicycle. Lastly, on this one, I'll quickly say this is a great from the Mexican Herald, the English language newspaper, where they're showing the cost of being a cyclist. Because you're going to crash, you're going to have like a 3,000, peso fractured skull, the loss of your eyes, dislocated shoulders, and they give monetary values to all these things. It's like this interesting actuarial understanding of the experience of being a cyclist. Okay. David Harvey here. The common sense notion that there is time and a place for everything gets carried into a set of prescriptions which replicate the social order by assigning social meanings to spaces and times. And indeed, the bicycle, one of the things that it does wherever it ends up being experienced, phenomenologically by the rider, is to collapse for individuals space and time through a very efficient means of speed. This conflict is also central to the idea of who controls the space of urban streets, but also who belongs in rural areas. Here we have El Caminante and El Turista having a conversation over what is a better form of transportation. For pilgrimage, is it the burro or the bicycle? And unfortunately for our cyclists, he's having to carry the thing. Speed was totally an obsession in the emergence of sport as well. Here, images of the Velodromo Uruguayo and races and racers, same thing, fiestas and sports, even before covering widely soccer in Argentina, we had, coverage of bicycle sport, and from the enthusiasm that's developed in the period around the speed and modernity of the bicycle itself. And that's also implicates the class and racial identities of most of who is assumed to be your average cyclist. Here, the sportsman is the guy who's into golf, rowing, fencing, dancing, and riding the bike. All right, so the orientation of this time and space is not only about collapsing speed, but also looking to the future for the way that technology could improve one's control over themselves, their environment, and their destiny. That also caused anxiety here. The men of decades, like we have ayer is two guys having a duel dressed like they're in the 16th century. Today is a man tipping his hat to a woman on a bicycle. And then tomorrow is the women dressed like men and the men all dressed like women, where the freedom that this potentially offered to women was seen as like a danger to invert gender relations in Latin America. Same kind of thing that was worrying people in Britain and the United States. This idea also manifests in these cartoons celebrating the arrival of New Year's all the time. So here's 1896, old man past his death, and the new youth and kid is on a bicycle. Same thing in another newspaper in Mexico City. The year that's behind us and leaving, and the year that's coming. How people will up in the left-hand corner there, it says this is how people will draw time in the future. I also like that we have long before what do you call it, the Wizard of Oz. This is like decades before the Wizard of Oz. We have a bruja on a modernizing the bruja here with the bicycle instead of a broom. Okay. Oh, yeah. Domestic labor for the next century will be transformed by the application of technology, which includes a woman reading the newspaper while she's riding a bike, and the bike is actually doing the washing of her clothes, or, is powering the washing of the clothes. All right, let me finish up here. The last thing, one last image on how this all kind of connects back to this idea of mixed temporalities and uneven development. With this nice little quote by George Lakoff, the heart of metaphor is inference. And this image of the political economy envisioned by a united Americas, a Pan-Americanism. The front wheel here says this is the union of the Pan-American Union. We have an indigenously dressed woman on the front of the bike and a modern bloomer-wearing woman on the back who represent the United States and Latin America. And this tandem shows how this notion of a geopolitics in which the modernity of the United States and the quote-unquote tradition of Latin America is grafted together into a single politics of the future, exemplified by the bicycle, and obviously one that would much more benefit the United States than the places in Latin America, while simultaneously seeing their participation as itself a form of participation in modernity. As in, Latin America was already modern and not, always trying to become modern, if you will. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Chad, those images are awesome. Very cool. Okay. Oh, wait, I'm next. Okay, I'm last. Wait, hold on. Let's see if I can share my screen, everybody. So, Hold on. I think I just. Can everyone see that? Okay, hold on. It's not working, everybody. Hold on.
I couldn't figure it out either, Jackie.
Oh, I have all these great images to show. Okay, hold on. Nothing, guys?
Are you playing your slides in a window?
Hold on.
There's also the question of permissions, like you had to give your computer permissions.
Yeah, I thought I did that. I'm so sorry, you guys. I'm so sorry, everyone. It's just not working. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I'm so sorry, everybody. It says allowed to share entire screen. Allow. And it just won't do it. Oh, well, I'm sorry, everybody. I've got some really cool images to share.
So is there a list of like windows, or is it only entire screen?
Let's see.
When you click on the drop down or whatever,
it says share entire screen or modernity and modernization in Latin America.
When you click on the modernization thing, it just doesn't come up.
So the PowerPoint itself that I have open on my computer is not allowing me to share this.
What happens if you click on entire screen?
Let's see. Allow. And it's just not allowing it. Oh, I'm so sorry, everybody. All right, well, I'll talk anyway. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, everyone. I've got some really cool images to show that I cannot show. But so this research is part of my forthcoming book, but it's also, I think, maybe my next project. And so we'll see. And I would have had a more clear answer for you about whether or not this is my next project or not, had I been able to go to the archives in 2020 and this year, but I have not. So TBD on that, but it is part of my forthcoming book. So the title is Mediating Local Modernization and Water Use in Porfirian Mexico. The regime of Porfirio Diaz from 1876 to 1911 facilitated liberal capitalistic development in all sorts of ways. We all know this, we all teach it. One of these ways was the federalization of waterways. During the colonial and early national periods, determinations over who could access naturally occurring water sources, i.e. rivers, lakes, the like, as well as man-made wells, were negotiated between private parties and arbitrated by local governments, ayuntamientos. As such, ayuntamientos, municipalities, collected the majority of revenues from water usage rights for centuries. During the second half of the 19th century, liberal political and economic policies, along with more stability in both of these realms, impelled officials to begin to centralize and, in addition to this, reduce local control over water. Enacted in June of 1888, the Federal Waters Law, or the Ley sobre Vías Generales de Comunicación, stipulated that the federal government, represented by the Secretaría de Fomento, or the Porfirian Development Ministry, henceforth had jurisdiction to adjudicate usage rights on waterways that were either navigable or that served as borders between countries or states. All waterways that were not navigable or that did not designate a border between states or countries remained under usufruct laws, i.e. under municipal control, as they had always been. The 1888 Waters Law was, quote unquote, hastily passed by the Congress to spur dam construction in the northern Laguna region, where they were working to create large-scale cotton farming. But of course, the scope of the law was national, and in light of the environmental, economic, and human impact of large water infrastructure projects in Mexico City and the North Laguna region primarily, scholars have understandably focused on how the 1888 law affected these regions. However, I believe that there are a lot of compelling reasons to examine the law's effects in regions that lay beyond the federal government's developmental purview, as I argue in my book, especially in the small central state of Tlaxcala, Mexico. So while Tlaxcala was not heralded for its contributions to Porfirian modernization and development, competition over resources there, particularly over water, was very fierce for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, Tlaxcala was the second most densely populated region in all of Mexico, after El Estado de Mexico, where Mexico City was during this time period. High population density meant that during the rainy season, floods were a constant problem. Floods had been a problem in Tlaxcala and in the Valle de Mexico for literally since humans had lived there. And they often displaced residents during this time period and before this as well. In the dry season, of course, then Tlaxcalans complained about water shortages. Everyday activities, bathing, cooking, laundry, all of this, most Tlaxcalans still relied on naturally occurring water sources to do these kinds of things. But increasingly, in the second half of the 19th century, it was irrigation and industrialization that began to siphon off large quantities of water away from the two main rivers in Tlaxcala, which were the Atoyac rivers and the Zahuapa rivers. Increased rates of land privatization created more property owners than previously existed in Tlaxcala, as in many places in Mexico during this time period, thus augmenting the demand for water. And what's interesting in Tlaxcala, and I talk much more about this in the book, of course, is that there are some hacendados in Tlaxcala. I mean, there's not as many as, let's say, like in Morelos, right, where famously there's all these sugar barons who are taking over the small plots of land. In Tlaxcala, actually, throughout the Porfirian period, there's still a lot of small holders. They're forced to be private holders, at least on paper. And so there's actually an increased demand for private water usage, but it's not only by hacendados and haciendas, which is normally how we understand the Porfiriato. And so you have a lot of small landowners also building like small canales and levees and dikes. So all sorts of water related construction and infrastructure. Despite that the federal government was less interested in developing Tlaxcala than more export oriented regions, Tlaxcala was also no backwater. It's in the middle of the country. And the first railroad in Mexico, which I would now show you an image of this railroad, it connects Mexico City to, as Beau previously discussed, the port of Veracruz, right? So the window to Mexico's, the Atlantic world for Mexico. And so it's a big deal. It's not in the middle of nowhere. It's very close to Puebla City, and it's very close to Mexico City, the capital, right? And plenty of people, especially industrialists, saw Tlaxcala as a place to invest. Evidence of this is over the course of the entire Porfiriato, 10 textile and glass factories are built in Tlaxcala. Factories are built all over central Mexico during this time period, but in Tlaxcala as well. And there's also dozens of smaller mills, aguardiente plants. Tlaxcala is a huge producer of pulque during that time period, and still, but you know. And so all of these, both small and large scale industries, channeled river water to fuel steam engines, hydraulic motors, and eventually hydroelectric dams. Factories located downstream in the state of Puebla also relied on these rivers, and factory owners insisted that their water use did not affect natural water levels, but many farmers, of course, disagreed. So high population density, socioeconomic diversity, and development and industrialization exacerbated competition between water users in Tlaxcala during this time period into the 20th century. At the same time, the ambiguous terms of the 1888 Federal Waters Law made it even more difficult to arbitrate all of these conflicts that are arising over water during this time period. So there's a lot of different reasons for this, and I expound upon this in a couple chapters in my book. So for just a rough outline here. So first and foremost, when the 1888 Federal Waters Law was put into effect in Tlaxcala, it actually separated the jurisdictions of these two main rivers. So the Atoyac River is federalized because it distinguishes, it's a border between Tlaxcala and Puebla. So the Atoyac is federalized. But the Zahuapan locally isn't. So it remains under local jurisdiction. This is very confusing for everyone who lives there, right? Why do I have to petition the federal government for water access rights along one river, but then my ayuntamiento or municipality for rights over this other river, and they're not that far from one another. And right now I would show you an image and a map of how close those two rivers are together. So picture it in your head, do a little Googling. And so according to the terms of the Waters Law, also the Atoyac River was navigable, right? Because that's supposed to be a navigable river. But in reality, it was often the case that people who used the Atoyac River actually relied on water from the Zahuapan River during certain times of the year. So the Zahuapan, for practical purposes, was actually more navigable in as much as it contained more water than the Atoyac did at certain parts of the year. So the Waters Law did not account for seasonal variations to a waterway's navigability. What is more, this law separation of the two rivers based on their navigability, again, did not reflect Tlaxcalan's lived reality. So as one example of this, after the Secretaría de Fomento denied one man, Gerardo Emilio Heredias, access rights to the locally managed Zahuapan for his textile mill, Heredias replied to the Secretaría de Fomento to indicate that he, quote, did not agree with the federal decision and further implored that a more thorough study would no doubt reveal how the Zahuapan is indeed navigable, because the federal Waters Law should federalize it. Since the Zahuapan River's jurisdiction still resided with municipalities, the Waters Law therefore inferred the Zahuapan to be unnavigable. Those who owned multiple properties and utilized waters from both rivers, so such as Alfredo and Bernardo Caso, who had 3 farms that drew water from the Atoyac and 1 from the Zawapan. These guys became super frustrated by having to manage separate bureaucratic processes, and the fact that the Atoyac and Zawapan, as you can see from this invisible map, ran so close together and eventually formed part of the same water course made it all the more vexing. So in addition to its unclear terms, the Waters Law also imposed new provisions on federal water uses that encouraged regional parties' involvement in water management. Article 2 of this law specified that Riverside residents will have free use of waters that they need for their domestic purposes. Moreover, petitioners asking for water rights access rights had to provide, quote, legitimate titles. Or failing these, they had to prove that they had been using the water source for 10 years. This is pretty normal when we're talking about natural resource rights in Mexico. The Secretaría de Fomento would only grant a petitioner exclusive rights to a water access point, even on the federalized Atoyac River, when the request did not, quote, threaten or alter the course of the rivers or canals or affect residents' water usage downstream. The law concludes by stating that any complication that violated water's, quote, communal order, and you're like, what does this mean? That's a great question. Or any conflict between, quote, private parties would be handled by the appropriate local jurisdiction rather than the federal Secretaría de Fomento. So what was that federalizing for if everything is still going to be managed locally? So the federal government may have passed the 1888 Waters Law to better centralize Mexico's waterways and to grant water concessions to export conglomerates, exactly like what happened in La Laguna region, for example. But in places like Tlaxcala, where large-scale international export production barely existed, and less was at stake for Mexico's national finances and its international reputation, the federal government did not really care about the law's consequences there. But of course, on the ground, the people who live there did. Those who were apprised of local geography, conditions, and relationships cared deeply about water management in Tlaxcala, and their livelihoods depended on it. Determining whether a petitioner met the federal water law's requirements nearly always necessitated local parties' input. Thus, because of its confusing terms, the federal waters law actually increased the capacity of regional officials, especially the state governor, who's the focus of my first monograph, to shape water dispute outcomes. Sometimes regional officials enforce the law's terms to ensure that modernization and development did not completely undermine water's inherent nature as a shared resource. Examinations of the petitions that Tlaxcalan submitted to the Federal Secretaría de Fomento, which are housed today in the AHA, or the Archivo Histórico del Agua in Mexico City, which is a wonderful archive to work in if you've never been there, alongside documentation from various state and local collections, exemplify these arguments that I'm making here. And right now I would show you this beautiful table that is invisible. Okay, approximately 50 files can be found in the AHA in which a petitioner, most often a hacendado or textile factory owner, wrote to the federal government asking for private waterway access in Tlaxcala. Those who petitioned the federal government directly typically required larger quantities of water, usually had more means and influence than the majority of water users in Tlaxcala, who were either smallholders or villagers. Federal petitioners usually requested to build a dam, a canal, or a pipeline, or to expand one of these. It's often the case that people are writing to the Secretaría de Fomento to ask for what's called another toma de agua, right? Another water access point where they would build infrastructure or siphon off water or something related to water-related infrastructure. Table 1, which is invisible, summarizes these petitions. The table outlines the name of the petitioner, the property for which the water would be used, the dates of the petition, the waterway and its jurisdiction, as determined by the Secretaría de Fomento, and lastly, the table briefly summarizes the federal, state, and local responses to these requests. Most petitioners requested to use either rivers, the Atoyac or the Zawapan in Tlaxcala, but there were also some inquiries about local lakes. Reading through the summation of petitions, it becomes understandable why an owner of a larger property or factory may have wanted the federal government to confirm their water access rights. Doing so, they likely hoped, would streamline their requests and get those pesky regional administrators off their backs. In Tlaxcala, customary water use laws required larger landowners, industrialists to build dams, bridges, and flood control infrastructure as conditions of their private water access. These projects were to be paid for out of their own pockets. In Tlaxcala, the governor reinforced these customary practices all throughout the Porfirian period, albeit selectively, even along the Atoyac River, which fell under federal management of 1888. So the point here, right, is the state governor, who was the longest governor under Porfirio Diaz's regime, he actually uses and enforces these customary water laws, despite the fact that he really wants to develop Tlaxcala. He's obsessed with development, just like any other good Porfirista is. But at the same time, what I argue in my book is that he also realizes if he upsets the apple cart too much by taking away people's water and their ability to obtain water, they're going to be mad. And they're no longer, they're going to revolt. And so here I'm trying to tie together politics and water. And I do this more in depth in my book. Water users along the Atoyac and the Zawapan expressed great consternation, to say the least, when the governor or another regional party imposed conditions on their water use, even after wealthier petitioners. They hire notaries, lawyers, engineers to make these fancy mathematical calculations and blueprints and maps, all of which I have beautiful examples for you that I cannot show right now, to prove that their water use would not disrupt what was known as the, quote, communal order of water. Sometimes industrialists and haciendados petitions for water access are granted by the federal government, but they're still sometimes outright denied or otherwise obstructed by regional parties, whether that's the governor, neighbors, and these neighbors are not always like fellow rich folks or wealthier folks, haciendados, industrialists, sometimes they're villages. And these villages successfully petition both the municipality and the state to intervene to prevent this guy upstream from taking another toma de agua that would disrupt the natural water levels and either flood their lands during the rainy season or during the dry season, take water away from what they need. Despite the evidence that shows how complicated water management often was on the local levels during the Porfiriato, Mexico's hydrological history between this time period, between 1888 and 1910, so when some waterways are federalized but others aren't, is curiously understudied as compared to periods before and after. And this is where I'm hoping this is my next project, right, is more, I think, focusing on water, TBD. These 22 years in which some of Mexico's waterways were federalized while others persisted under local jurisdiction. And at the same time, factories' water consumption is peaking, is vital. Untangling jurisdictional quagmires like those in Tlaxcala reveals how water came to be used by regional despots as a tool of political mediation. Attempts to regulate Tlaxcala's lived environment were done on a case-by-case basis and overseen mostly by the state governor, not the federal government. The governor sometimes continued to impose water use stipulations on all water users regardless of their class or status. In short, the story of Porfirian modernization as related to water use in Tlaxcala, and I think elsewhere, is not one in which industrialists were allowed to run roughshod over popular classes' water use needs. Moreover, laws intended to facilitate and expedite modernization, like the 1808 Federal Waters Law, did not always produce their intended effect. In fact, ironically, the federalization of water in Tlaxcala created even more opportunities for regional officials to dictate how water was locally managed. And in the long term, I've done a little bit of this work where I'm tracing these conflicts and disputes well after, so all rivers are federalized in 1910, and then of course the Constitution of 1917 happens. But these disputes are ongoing into the 1920s, into the 1930s. So I think that there's a lot to unpack here. I have a feeling that the same kinds of issues are going on in like El Estado de Mexico, in Puebla, and I want to look at Veracruz as well, from what I understand. And so I'm really hoping to get into these state and local archives in different places to do more comparative analysis as the second project, and to kind of shift the conversation and the focus of, how did land cause the Mexican Revolution and all of the problems that happened afterwards to water. And in my book, I show that water is actually key to showing how the Porfiriato endures in places like Tlaxcala. But then what happens after this? Like, what happens with all of these disputes, and some of which are never resolved? So what are all these federal laws and promises really doing when it comes to water? And this is what I hope the second project will be. We'll see. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie.
Okay, everyone. So questions and comments. I can't even tell who's here, but we can ask each other questions and comments as well.
Your paper, Jackie, made me think about La Comarca, La Laguna, where, you know, from Torreon on down, like during this exact same period, it's actually like management and control of water resources that revolutionizes agriculture, makes it a cotton, you know, major cotton producing region with lots and lots of conflict between landowners and the state.
And today that's still happening, I believe, across the U.S.-Mexican border. So, I mean, the potential to bring this discussion into the contemporary era is really interesting.
Where the Rio Grande dries up long before it gets to the...
Exactly.
Well, it was so interesting to hear about all of your research, and really is helping me think too about my use of modernity, how I'm grappling with what that means in this context, what it means in like 1950 versus like in the long history in Latin America. So I appreciate hearing all of your projects. It's been a while since I've heard about other people's research, actually, so it's really nice to do that again.
I think it's interesting, Lisa, that the antipathy towards Adobe, when it's not like there weren't earthquakes happening like for the preceding, 300 years with lots of Spanish Adobe construction, right? It's like it's bringing an attitude of tradition is bad and modern is good, while it's, yes, there was damage, but it's a huge earthquake and still was pretty durable. Not as durable as the Inca stuff, but, durable nonetheless.
And it wasn't as dangerous, frankly. I mean, that's another reason why there aren't as many fatalities. Like, if Adobe crumbles and falls, it's kind of crumbling in pieces, not like a big, huge, block of concrete falling or, something like that. And so, I mean, in Mark Healy's work, it was really interesting to see how much Adobe was associated with something that was unhygienic, and that kind of language framing it as like bad and not even like a good traditional, but just backwards, right? But I think a lot of it too is just this obsession with like, we have to use modern expertise to build cities, and the other limitation of Adobe was how high you can build it. And so, there was this,
which is important for resilience against earthquakes.
Right. Yeah. So it's like, there's this fantasy of like these high rise, like affordable housing complexes in Cusco, which mostly don't materialize at all. But yeah, it just really struck me, how much there was this desire and faith in like what the foreign experts were saying. And also, this is something that a lot of people have commented on, but, these sort of developmentalists, mid-20th century developmentalists really were looking for just these types of development that you could just do anywhere, that would work in the Andes and that would work in Colombia and that would work in Mexico. And so they really weren't thinking as much about local tradition, like how has Cusco coped with earthquakes in the past. They weren't really interested in that. They were just interested in what is the best way to make this city going forward that we can use as a model for other places in the Andes. And it was just really wild how detached it was from any local history or reality.
What is the way we can use this disaster to remake the city in our own image?
Yeah. And there's a lot of commentary like that the disaster was a good thing for Cusco, because it was like the stepping stone to help enable it to become a modern city. And so, there's a question in the chat for you.
Ooh, yes.
Chad. It says, I wonder if Chad or any of you can expand on this tension between modernity versus traditional backwards 19th century approaches, and how Latin American communities grappled with changes that could come with the new, for example, gender roles, as Chad pointed out.
I mean, what I would say is that like those very categories themselves become, positions to deploy, power relations. Like conservatives would see the changes as within a framework of reaction, while others, want to embrace them, in part because of their own experiences of like the actual experiential level of riding a bicycle or something like that. So I think like we see the same thing with Lisa's stuff, like that in both philosophical or academic or developmentalist positions, and like in the actual popular experiences of changes, that those categories are an ever shifting set of expectations and practices that are mostly deployed to screw people over.
Yeah, and totally, sometimes just totally unuseful. And actually I get really frustrated because I know I'm going to get pushback, because I know that people like want all of us to constantly talk about like the push and pull between tradition and modernity. And it's like, well, at least when you're looking at water, like customary water laws or tradition, I mean, you can't completely ignore that. And actually you can make these modern, you can adapt them to these new so-called modern laws. So I don't even, how helpful is it to even talk about this dichotomy? It's not a dichotomy. I mean, in practice, that's just not how things are working on the ground.
Beau would probably have more to say about this, but like I think if you look at the recent literature on capitalism and slavery, like the real fundamental tension here is that people don't want to accept that capitalism can subsume mixed temporalities into itself at both an experiential level, at a political level, across the board, and that actually is the fundamental constitutive dynamic of it. So like the things that are called backward are then slotting the groups of people associated with it into a particular position of exploitation. But they are coexisting. They are like, the peones are there, and they aren't not modern because they're existing, at the same time. Like this forever moving horizon constantly is trying to, reorganize people, places, space, and time. But that in and of itself is, for me, what is definitive of modernity. So I think that the whole question of when did Latin America become modern is the absolute wrong question to
totally agree.
To ask and argue about.
And yet an entire canon of, economic history in Latin America has built itself on this question.
And continues to.
Yeah. I mean,
yes.
It's really problematic.
An interesting iteration of that. So in the historic center of Cusco, after the earthquake, there were all of these arguments about we have to preserve the historic buildings, And one of the problems that happened, what led to the deterioration of these buildings, was all of these people cramming into them. Like they were designed as like a home for like one family, and now there's like 12 families living in there. And so we have to kick all of these people out for like historic preservation. But, you know, obviously it was really just a way to get poor people out of the city center for tourism. And so you see these like convoluted arguments about we must have modern affordable housing for people for historic preservation of the city center, but it was really just about moving poor people out. And again, the affordable housing pretty much never materializes on a scale that could rehouse all of these people that were being displaced from, you know, in the name of historic preservation. So yeah, I've always been interested in how historic preservation is a modern project, and you know, how it kind of fits in as a rationale for moving people and moving things to other spaces.
Right, and where authenticity becomes the justification of the commodification of people, practices, culture.
Yeah.
I bet that there's plenty of city planners in Veracruz right now who are like, man, I wish we hadn't turned that wall down, or we could have the same, you know, we could be Cartagena too.
Yeah, exactly.
Plenty. And I was just thinking about this issue of modernization in terms of the medicinal practices. During this time period, you have all of these individuals coming in saying, well, let's experiment on people, one, but also they're continuing practices in trying to transition and commodify some of the practices that were happening in dealing with yellow fever patients. So you have at the same time of individuals traveling and saying, well, let's try these freezer techniques and let's rearrange the hospital, which many people who lived in Veracruz didn't go to the hospital in Veracruz. You also have these medicinal practices of people traveling from outside of Veracruz, in towns nearby, who come in and they implement uses of certain practices that are more effective than some of these modern practices. In fact, one of the things that's interesting to me is this tension or this idea of like modernity and looking at the backwardness. Well, these efforts at modernity actually infect more people, right? Like we're modern, so let's see how yellow fever is spread, and let's transmit the virus and then see how it impacts people, versus in these traditional practices, it's, well, we need to reduce the virus and reduce the spread of it. So for me, in this, what will be a book project is looking at how some of these practices actually end up spreading the disease more than what's happening in the seemingly backwards efforts.
I'm so interested, Beau, in hearing more about the Charleston connections too. I'll have to follow up with you about that. See what else I can bring into my teaching and stuff. So
definitely. Oh, I did have a question for you, Lisa. So given that, well, you know, we're all limited in our travels, what research are you able to do here, or are you able to do in the U.S. for, I don't know, international relief efforts or ideas about these international planners going?
Yeah. Well, I was really lucky, actually. I can't complain too much about not being able to go to the Rockefeller Center because I had this sabbatical in 2019. So I was able to do a lot of research, by which I mean collecting images of tons of documents. So I do have quite a bit to work with. I did some research in the U.S. National Archives, the State Department stuff, which is where I found this report that was commissioned by the UN. But they also have in the U.S. Archive, the U.S. National Archives, the American Red Cross Association. And then I was in Peru, so I did some research there with some of their sort of regional departmental level reports and documents. And also the Archdiocese archives were really helpful because so much of the damage was done to churches and other church buildings. And so I found really good material there. And then I was also fortunate enough to convince Fulbright to let me go to France and use the UNESCO archives. And I also managed to go to the International Red Cross archives in Geneva. And so I do feel quite fortunate.
Suffering.
I have a wealth of things. It feels almost the opposite of my first project, where I was like trying to piece together fragments, and now I feel like have like this avalanche of sources, and I'm just trying to like work my way through it. And my attention span for doing that kind of work has just been off. But you know, that's why this was really helpful to kind of really push me. I had been mostly working through Red Cross stuff actually after I got back from travel, and so I'm trying to push myself to some of the other stuff that I have now. But one of the things, you know, this, you know, I think kind of relates to what, you know, arguments you're making too, about this sort of international movements. I'm really interested in who was interested in Cusco and why, and who was interested in sending aid there. And like another like sort of side aspect of this project is looking at the US government. So in 1950, you know, like early Cold War, but as most of the, like, well, not most, but a lot of the newer literature now is sort of saying we need to like rethink or recenter like what's going on with like the Cold War. And the US officials were really preoccupied with Spain and Argentina. And so that's something I'm really interested in, like looking at this earthquake as a way where Argentina and Spain were trying to assert more authority in South America during this period. And the US really saw Spain and Argentina as its main rivals in terms of who it was competing with. Like they literally kept a chart, US officials, of like newspaper articles about humanitarian relief, and were like tallying how many good articles are there about Spain, how many good articles are there about Argentina, and saying like they're getting better press than us. Why is nobody recognizing our great contributions to the relief effort? So yeah, that's something else that I'm kind of looking at. Another angle of the project is this sort of international relations and how these disasters were seen as useful for, you know, foreign relations purposes, diplomatic strategies, things like that. So yeah,
Sounds
that's
like the trip to Spain and Argentina is in order.
I mean, yeah, that I feel like that would be really nice, but also I'm not counting on that anytime soon. But yeah, there's really some interesting stuff about that. So you know, it's sort of looking at, that's more of like the short-term humanitarian relief side of things, who is kind of competing for attention, and then looking at the kind of long-term you know, ideas about development. And there were really grand ideas for this poor little city, and most of them just don't work out. Like it was supposed to be this modern industrial center, and it ends up becoming, you know, mostly a service-oriented economy for tourism in the long run. And so I'm kind of interested in how did the other things fall out of the picture, and why did the international technicians and development people lose interest in this, or lose faith in Cusco as a project, and how did the people in Cusco feel about that? Because there's a lot of local ideas about how the city should be rebuilt that I'm also really interested in, and you know, arguments about how the resources should be allocated and everything. So it's like a lot of voices I'm sifting through right now. It's been fun.
Any more questions from the invisible audience?
Oh, yeah, Claire, we should talk disasters sometime. And yeah, for Red Cross research, I also have to give a shout out to Julia Irwin, who, you know, is not at this conference, but is like the Red Cross archives expert extraordinaire. And she, if anyone needs to do research on the Red Cross, but she knows all of it in the Americas and beyond. So definitely she was really helpful for me in figuring out where to go and what to find.
I feel like too, you guys, is like a big middle finger to us all. I don't know how it is in your parts of the South, but here in the upstate of South Carolina, it was 36 degrees and I was driving down from my house. Like,
It's
That's a
not that
welcome
cold,
thing.
but
I like the change seasons.
it is definitely chilly. I feel like it was kind of abrupt here, though. You know, it was like 70 and kind of hot, and then all of a sudden it was like it was like 50 here this morning. So I'm happy, but it was fast.
the weather is the only thing I have to like hold over all of my family in Chicago. You know what's up. Like, anyway.
Yeah, I was gonna say it could be Chicago, but
Yeah.
I'll take this 40.
Yeah, no, me too. Yeah. Well, I guess that's Chad. Anything else you want to add, or
No, I just wanted to say it's delightful to see the three of you. I mean, I get to see Beau all the time now, but it's delightful to see the two of you.
yeah, this is really great.
This is great.
Likewise, good to see you all.
Hopefully we'll be able to do it.
Organizing. Thanks to Hoppin.
Yeah.
Yeah, shout out to Hoppin.
All right.
All right.
Good
Take
advice,
care, everybody.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
All right.
Ciao.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.